Arizona Territory, 1879. The sun was a white-hot hammer, and Olivia Hart was too weak to continue. Her legs buckled just past a dry wash, the cracked earth giving no mercy beneath her knees. Her lips were split, her hands blistered from hours of dragging herself forward. She had not seen a soul since sunrise. Strips of her calico skirt clung to her legs, dust caked and stiff with sweat. She tried to crawl another inch, but her body gave out, cheek pressed to the burning ground. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was a hawk circling overhead. Dawson Zeller did not expect to find a woman half dead in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. He had been riding west, tracing the edge of his cattle range, when his horse, Flint, jerked his head and snorted. That was when Dawson saw her curled in the sand like a broken branch, skin near the color of bone. He was off his saddle in a blink. "Ma'am," he said, kneeling in the dust. She didn't answer. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused. He pulled his canteen loose and tilted it to her mouth. "Come on now." "Drink," she coughed but swallowed. Her fingers twitched toward him, weak and trembling. "Got you," he muttered, lifting her carefully against his chest. She was light, too light and burning with fever. "You're gonna be all right." He carried her to his horse, mounted with her in front of him, and turned Flint north toward his homestead. Olivia woke to the sound of wind through cottonwoods and the scent of something warm and clean, wood smoke, maybe. She blinked slowly, her mouth dry, her body aching like it had been trampled by a herd. "You're in my cabin," a man said gently. "You've been out near 2 days." She turned her head. He was tall, younger than she expected, maybe in his 30s. His hair was dark, just brushing his collar, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow. He had kind eyes, steady and clear. "I thought I died," she rasped. He poured water into a tin cup and held it to her lips. "Not on my watch," she drank, then stared at him. "Where?" "Where am I?" "Outside Gila Bend. My land's a few miles off the Butterfield Trail. Name's Dawson Zeller." She watched him, wary. "Olivia Hart." He nodded once. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Hart." She tried to sit up but winced. "How did I get here? I found you in the desert." "You were unconscious, dehydrated. Wouldn't have lasted another hour in that heat." He paused. "What happened?" Olivia looked away, her hands fisted in the quilt. "I walked out of Yuma, headed east. I thought I could make it to Florence. On foot." "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because I had nowhere else to go." By the next morning, Olivia was stronger. Dawson brought her scrambled eggs and black coffee, and she managed to sit up to eat. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You got people waiting for you in Florence?" "No." She wiped her mouth with the corner of the quilt. "No one. You running from something." She hesitated. "Someone." Dawson nodded like he understood. "You're safe here." She studied him. "Why are you helping me?" He shrugged. "You needed help." Olivia swallowed hard. "Men don't do things like that for nothing." "I ain't most men." They locked eyes across the room. Something unspoken passed between them. By the 3rd day, she managed to step outside. The air was dry but cooler under the shade of the porch. Dawson was splitting firewood nearby, his shirt damp at the collar. He glanced at her, careful, still pale as a ghost. "I needed the sky," she said. He nodded and went back to chopping. She watched him work, the rhythm of it steady and sure. "You live out here alone?" she asked. "Yeah, no family." He paused, rested the axe handle against his shoulder. "No, they're gone. I am sorry." He gave a small nod. "What about you?" Olivia looked down. "I had a husband. He died in a mining collapse in California, then I had to get away from. Someone who wanted to keep me whether I wanted it or not." Dawson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. She looked up at him. "You do not know me. I could be lying." He walked over and handed her a tin cup of water. "I know what someone looks like when they've been through hell." "You ain't lying." Their fingers brushed. She did not pull away. That night, Olivia sat beside Dawson at the fire. He made rabbit stew and they ate in silence. She stared into the flames. "I had a son," she whispered. "His name was Felix. He died from fever 2 winters ago." Dawson's hand froze halfway to his mouth. "I am sorry. I think I stopped feeling after that until a few days ago when I saw your eyes looking down at me. I felt something again." Dawson looked at her, real and raw. "You scared the hell out of me. I thought I was too late." "You were not." He set his bowl aside. "You can stay if you want." She turned to him. "You sure?" He nodded. "I got room. You need rest, and I..." He hesitated, then met her gaze. "I want you here." She reached out and took his hand. Over the next week, Olivia found her strength again. She helped with chores, fed the chickens, and learned to patch fences. Dawson showed her how to saddle a horse. They laughed more. He watched her when she thought he was not looking. She caught him once and smiled. One afternoon, as they stood in the barn doorway with dusk falling in gold and lavender behind them, she said, "I never thought I would feel safe again." Dawson brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You are safe, with me." She leaned into him, heart pounding. He whispered, "You do not have to be alone anymore." "I know," she said softly, and then she kissed him. It was not rushed. It was not desperate. It was real. It was the beginning. The summer light was thinning, casting long shadows across the yard by the time Dawson returned from checking the trap lines. Olivia stood at the edge of the corral with one hand resting on the weathered post, watching the gelding inside pace along the fence. Her hair, newly washed that morning, caught the breeze and lifted in loose strands across her cheek. She didn't turn as Dawson approached. "You've got a coyote caught near the stream," he said as he stepped up beside her. "Took your advice and left it be. Figured we'd want the hide come autumn." She nodded slowly, eyes still on the horse. "He favors his left leg." Dawson followed her gaze. "Tangled with a rattler last month. He's healing, but it's slow going." "I could poultice it," she offered. "If you've got mustard seed and willow bark." He looked at her with quiet interest. "You know how to treat a snake wound." "I nursed a man through worse," she said. "He didn't deserve it, but I did it anyway." Dawson didn't press. He stepped back and gestured toward the shed. "Come see what I've got stowed. Might be we can fix him up." Inside the shed, she sifted through the shelves with practiced hands. Dawson leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching her with a kind of steady curiosity. "You ever work as a healer?" he asked. "No," she said, selecting a small jar and holding it to the light. "But I paid attention when others did. You do that enough, it sticks." He nodded. "You ever think about making it yours, settling somewhere, setting up for folks?" She was quiet a moment. "I never stayed long enough in any place to try." Dawson stepped aside as she passed him with the jar. "Might be different now." She paused at the door. "Might be." Later, she knelt beside the gelding, her hands sure and gentle. Dawson held the halter, murmuring low to keep the animal calm. The horse flinched once, but Olivia didn't pull back. "I couldn't save Felix," she said suddenly, her voice low, "but I can help this one." Dawson didn't speak. He laid a hand lightly on her shoulder, grounding her. When the work was done, they sat on the porch steps, the silence between them filled with the creak of branches and the occasional call of a mourning dove. Olivia rubbed her hands together, the dried poultice still clinging beneath her nails. "I used to dream about a place like this," she said, eyes on the horizon. "A patch of land, a quiet man, no one telling me where to go or who to be." Dawson's voice was soft. "What stopped you? Fear, mostly?" She looked down at her hands. "And men who didn't like being told no." He drew in a slow breath. "You don't owe anyone your life." She looked up at him. "You don't ask anything of me, you just let me be." "I want you here because you want to be," he said. "Not because you're afraid of what's behind you." "I'm not afraid now," she said. He looked at her then, really looked. "Good." That night the moon rose full and clear over the desert. Olivia lay awake on the cot, the window open to let in the breeze. She watched the shadows shift across the ceiling, listened to the faint sound of Dawson moving about the other room, the scrape of a chair, the rustle of paper, the quiet click of the lamp being turned down. She stood and stepped barefoot across the floor. His door was ajar. She knocked once, then pushed it open. He was sitting at the small desk, a half-written letter in front of him. He looked up, surprised but not startled. "I can't sleep," she said. He set the pen down. "You all right?" "I don't know what to do with peace," she said. "It's unfamiliar." He rose slowly and crossed to her. "You don't have to do anything with it, just let it settle." She stepped closer. "Can I stay?" He studied her, the lamp behind him casting half his face in shadow. "You sure?" "I wouldn't have come to your door if I wasn't." He didn't answer. Instead, he took her hand and led her to the chair by the window. They sat together, her head resting against his shoulder, the desert wind whispering through the cotton fields beyond. Neither spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The monsoon season arrived in the second week of August, sudden and fierce. Rain swept across the desert with a violence that rattled the shutters and turned the dry washes into angry, rushing streams. Dawson stood on the porch, hat pulled low, watching the sky turn the color of old bruises. Olivia joined him, wrapping her shawl tighter against the wind. "You ever seen a storm roll in like this?" he asked without looking away. "No," she said, stepping beside him. "California had thunder sometimes, but not like this." "This feels like the land's remembering something it can't forget." Dawson glanced at her, surprised. "That's a way of saying it I've never heard." She gave a small shrug. "Some things can't be explained plain." They watched together as lightning split the far-off ridge, the clap that followed hard enough to shake the porch boards beneath their boots. Dawson moved closer, his hand resting just behind her back, not touching, but near enough she could feel the warmth of him through the fabric. "I should check on the goats," he said. "I'll come." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right." They pulled their oilskins from the hook and she followed him into the wind. The path to the small lean-to was half mud already, and Olivia's skirt clung to her legs with every step. The goats bleated nervously as they approached, huddled against the far wall of the shelter. "They'll be all right," Dawson said, kneeling to adjust the latch on the gate. "I can't tell if I'm freezing or sweating," she muttered, brushing rain from her eyes. Welcome to Arizona. They worked together in the quickening downpour, reinforcing the fence with lengths of rope from the barn, checking the troughs. By the time they returned to the cabin, they were soaked through. Dawson lit a fire while Olivia peeled off her wet shawl and hung it near the stove. "You always this stubborn?" he asked, shaking out his sleeves. "You invited me along." He smiled faintly. "I suppose I did." She crouched in front of the fire, holding her hands out to the flame. "Feels like we outran something out there. I don't know what, but it feels good to be dry again." Dawson handed her a folded blanket. "I'll get coffee going." While he moved about the kitchen, Olivia's eyes drifted to the shelf above the hearth. She hadn't noticed it before two small wooden carvings sat side by side, worn smooth from handling. One was a horse, the other a tree. "These yours?" she asked. "My father carved them. Used to say if you could shape something with your hands, it meant you understood it." He paused. "They were the only things I took when I left Tennessee." "What made you leave?" Dawson poured water into the kettle, his expression unreadable. "My family didn't take kindly to my ideas about how men ought to treat others. I spoke up about something I saw, and that was the end of my welcome." Olivia turned to face him fully. "You stood up for someone, a boy. He was working on the neighbor's land, got whipped for asking for his pay. I said it wasn't right. Father said it wasn't my place." Dawson lifted his shoulders slightly. "I didn't see how a man could stay quiet about something like that." She watched him in silence, the firelight catching the planes of his face. "You paid a price for that. Maybe. But I'd pay it again." They stood there, the storm slowly easing into a quiet patter against the roof. Olivia stepped toward him, her feet bare on the wood floor. "I don't know many men who would." "I'm not most men," he said simply. She reached for his hand. "I know that." He laced his fingers with hers, and they stood like that until the kettle whistled. That night, after the fire died low and the storm moved on, they lay in Dawson's bed, the window cracked to let in the cool air. Olivia rested with her back to him, her hand tucked beneath her cheek. His arm draped around her waist, heavy and sure. "Do you think the land ever forgets what it's seen?" she asked quietly. "No," he said, "but I think it forgives in time." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you?" "I'm learning." She pressed her forehead to his. "Then I'll learn with you." He didn't answer with words. He didn't have to. The morning after the storm, the desert smelled different, like wet stone and the sharp green of creosote blooming after rain. Olivia stepped out early, drawn by the stillness. The air hadn't yet turned hot, and the sky held that fragile pale blue it only wore just after dawn. She carried a pail in one hand and a small basket in the other, heading toward the mesquite grove beyond the garden, where Dawson had mentioned wild onions sometimes grew after a good soaking. Dawson had risen before her, but she hadn't heard him go. He'd left a note scratched into the soft dirt outside the front step with the toe of his boot. "South fence." She smiled and stepped around it. The mesquites were heavy with dew, and her skirt brushed damp against her legs as she knelt beneath the largest tree, fingers parting the earth gently, searching. She worked in silence, the only sounds the rustle of branches and the distant call of quail. Her hands found a cluster of shoots, faintly purple at the base. She pulled them free, shook off the soil, and dropped them into her basket. A low voice startled her. "You've got a good eye." She turned to find Dawson standing a few paces off, a coil of wire slung over one shoulder, his hat pushed back. His shirt stuck to him in places from the work, and his boots were caked in mud. "I was hoping to surprise you with breakfast," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. "You still might." He tipped his hat back down. "Fence held better than I thought, just needed some tightening." She rose and offered him the basket. "These should soften up fine in the pan." He reached for it, but didn't take it right away. "You always get this quiet when you're thinking hard." She lowered the basket. "I was remembering something." "Good or bad?" She hesitated. "Neither, just a moment I thought I'd forgotten. My mother used to take me foraging early like this. She said the land will feed you if you know how to ask." Dawson tilted his head. "Sounds like she was wise." She was. Olivia looked back toward the cabin. "Her name was Marion. She died when I was 16. I haven't said her name out loud in years." Dawson didn't speak, just stepped closer and reached up to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were rough, but the touch was careful. "You can say it here if you want, as often as you need." She nodded once, lips pressed together. They walked back to the cabin side by side, the basket shared between their hands. Inside, Olivia lit the stove while Dawson fetched water. The onions sizzled in the pan and the smell filled the room. A breeze stirred the curtains and the air felt easier somehow. Over breakfast, Dawson unfolded a letter he'd kept tucked into his ledger. He slid it across the table to her. "I've been thinking on something." She wiped her hands and unfolded the note. The handwriting was slanted and neat, the paper creased near the corners. "You wrote to someone," she said. "My uncle. He manages a small supply post up near Prescott. I asked if there might be room for a healer in the area. I didn't name you, just said I knew someone capable." Olivia looked up. "You did that?" "I figured if you ever wanted to work with folks again, do more than patch up goats and the occasional cowboy, you might want the chance." She folded the letter carefully. "And if I don't, then it's just a letter. Won't change a thing between us." She set it beside her plate, fingers resting on it lightly. "You're not trying to send me off." Dawson leaned forward. "No, I want you here. That hasn't changed." She looked at him a long moment. "Then I'll think on it." "But I won't go unless you come too." He gave her a single, quiet nod. The rest of the day passed without urgency. Dawson mended a piece of tack near the barn while Olivia sat on the porch, stitching a tear in her bodice. The sun moved high and slow across the sky, and the distant peaks shimmered under its weight. They didn't speak much, but the silence felt different now, like something shared. As evening came, Olivia stood in the doorway watching Dawson finish up the last of the day's work. He moved easily, sure of his place in the land around him. She stepped down into the yard, her bare feet pressing into the warm dust. "You ever think about building more out here?" she asked. He looked up from the rail he was hammering. "Like what?" She walked to him, resting her hand on the top beam. "A second cabin, maybe a little room for drying herbs, a table big enough for more than two." Dawson set the hammer down. "You planning on feeding the whole territory?" She smiled. "Just thinking ahead." He brushed his hand along the rail beside hers. "I'd build it with you." She turned toward him. "That's what I wanted to hear." And he kissed her there with the scent of sage in the air and the sun sinking low behind the hills. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't uncertain. It was steady, like the land beneath their feet. The days shortened. The heat softened into bearable warmth, and the cicadas gave up their long summer chorus. In the quiet of early autumn, Dawson began cutting lumber from the fallen cottonwood near the dry arroyo. He worked in the mornings, while the shadows were long and forgiving, and Olivia sorted through bunches of dried desert herbs in the lean-to they'd added just behind the cabin. She'd fashioned a drying rack from old rope and willow branches, and it held bundles of sage, chamomile, and bladderpod she'd collected from the hillsides east of the property. One afternoon, Dawson set down his saw and wiped his brow with the back of his wrist. Olivia was sitting cross-legged in the dust beside a pile of split wood, arranging kindling into neat bundles tied with twine. "You always this good with your hands?" he asked, stepping around the pile. "I had to be," she said, brushing a strand of sweat-damp hair from her cheek. "When you don't have much, you learn to make do. I once boiled pine bark to line a cradle I built out of a packing crate." He crouched beside her. "You had someone to make that for." Her hands paused. "A neighbor girl back in California. Her husband got run off by a debt collector. She was 7 months along with nothing to sleep on but dirt. I wasn't going to let her baby come into the world like that." "You ever think about having a child of your own again?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him, her face unreadable for a moment. "I stopped letting myself want it." Dawson didn't push. He reached for a bundle and tied it off, fingers working beside hers. After a while, she said, "But lately I've been thinking, if it came about, I wouldn't turn from it." He looked at her then, steady and sure. "Neither would I." They kept working in silence, but something had shifted. The space between them felt different, full of something unspoken but understood. Later that week, they rode into Gila Bend together. Olivia wore Dawson's extra hat to keep the sun off her face, and he'd traded her apron for a borrowed blue blouse he'd found folded at the bottom of a chest, something his mother had left behind decades ago. It fit her well enough, and she'd mended the worn collar before pulling it on. At the mercantile, Dawson picked up a sack of flour and a box of cartridges. Olivia lingered near the shelves of paper and ink. She ran her fingers over a folded map and then picked up a blank ledger. "You thinking of starting something?" Dawson asked, setting the flour on the counter. She turned the ledger in her hands. "I've been keeping notes on what grows where, what blooms after storms, what mixes ease pain. I thought maybe I could write it down proper." The storekeeper, an older woman with a stiff back and keen eyes, leaned her elbows on the counter. "You a healer of sorts," Olivia said. "Well, Dr. Kemper passed last spring. Folks been patching themselves up with vinegar and guesswork since. You ask me, we could use someone with a steady hand and a decent eye." Olivia glanced at Dawson. He nodded once. "I'll think about it," she said. They rode back under a wide sky striped with red. When they reached the homestead, Dawson unloaded the supplies while Olivia walked to the edge of the garden. A rabbit had gotten in again, and she knelt to inspect the damage. "Tomorrow I'll patch the fence better," Dawson called to her. "You want me to trap it?" She shook her head. "No, let it be. It was hungry, same as anyone." That night they made corn cakes and boiled beans. After the dishes were washed, Olivia brought out the ledger and began writing beneath the lamp. Dawson sat nearby, whittling a spoon from a length of juniper. "You always need something to do with your hands?" she asked, not looking up. He shrugged. "Idle time makes me restless." She smiled faintly. "You ever think about marrying again?" He paused his carving. "I used to think it wasn't for me, not after the way things ended back home, but now—" He set the spoon down and looked at her. "Now I know better." She closed the ledger. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm offering one," he said. "If you'll have me." Her eyes didn't waver. "I will." They married under the mesquites the following Sunday. The preacher from Maricopa rode in on a gray mule, dust-streaked and smiling. Olivia wore a dress she had sewn from muslin Dawson traded for, and Dawson wore his father's vest, the buttons polished to a dull shine. A few neighbors came, ranchers, a widow from 20 miles out, 2 children with sunburned noses and bare feet. The preacher spoke plain and quick, and when he asked if they meant to keep each other, Dawson didn't hesitate. "I do," he said, his voice low and firm. Olivia's answer was just as sure. Afterward, they served coffee and molasses bred out under the cottonwoods. The children chased chickens, and the widow offered to trade her sourdough starter for some of Olivia's balm. By late afternoon, everyone had gone, and the land fell quiet again. That night, Olivia lay with her head tucked beneath Dawson's chin, her palm resting on his chest. The windows were open to the breeze, and the stars burned clear above the branches. "You think we'll do all right?" she murmured. "I know we will," he said. "You and me were built for weathering things." She smiled against his skin. "And for building." In the months that followed, Olivia's remedies found their way into every cabin within a day's ride. Folks came for tinctures and salves, but they stayed to sit on the porch and trade news or linger beside the goats. Dawson expanded the fence line. Olivia planted wild oregano and desert marigold. In the evenings, she wrote in her ledger, and he carved spoons and laughter lines deepened around their eyes. By the next spring, the garden had doubled. Olivia's belly rounded beneath her apron, and Dawson built a cradle from cottonwood, carefully sanding each edge smooth. He lined it with quilt batting, stitched by Olivia's hand. One night, as the coyotes howled far off and the fire crackled low, Dawson laid a hand gently over hers. "You ever think we'd come to this?" She looked at him, her face soft with peace. "I didn't dare. But I'm glad I was wrong." He leaned in and kissed her, slow and certain. They stayed that way along while two people who had wandered far, who had lost more than most, and who had at last found what they needed in each other. Not rescue, not escape, but rest, and something solid to build on. And they never left it behind.